Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hello and welcome back as we continue through Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius, which is a course that I ran in 2024. This time we're going to be taking a look at some secondary material as we go back and forth between looking at the constellation of philosophy and looking at some supporting material. This time we'll be taking a look at the emergence of a system of thought known as Neoplatonism. And so we're going to go back to the beginning of early Greek thought, of early Platonic thought, and trace that as it develops and moves up to the kind of thing that Boethius would be most directly familiar with, because there most certainly is a kind of Christian Neoplatonism at play in Boethius' thought, very much as there was in Augustine's thought. And so I hope that you enjoy this philosophical survey today. Hello and welcome as we discuss some of the major philosophical influences on Boethius as seen in the Constellation of Philosophy. Now, if you've read any of the Constellation at this point, you know that Boethius is pretty fast and loose with his references to classical pagan philosophy and poetry, which some find odd for a Christian theologian who has been stripped of nearly all earthly fortunes and very well may be facing death, and history tells us that he absolutely was facing death as he would be executed. However, you have to keep in mind his position. This is a Roman, Catholic, Trinitarian Christian under the heretical Arian Ostrogothic King Theodoric, who took control of Italy after killing Odoacer, who deposed the last Roman emperor. And so, as a Catholic, Trinitarian-affirming Roman Christian, Boethius is very much an other relative to the Arian Germanic king above him. And this difference was surely magnified when Boethius was stripped of his rank and goods through no apparent fault of his own. And this gulf that he faced between his ultimate accuser, the king, and his current position very likely caused him to appreciate vestiges of his rich pagan heritage alongside his theological convictions and intellectual framework. He was a Roman and a Christian, and both of those formed an important part of his identity. In The Discarded Image, C.S. Lewis says like this, quote, "Catholic Christendom and that high pagan past to which he felt so deep a loyalty were united in his outlook by their common contrast to Theodoric, and his huge, fair-skinned, beer-drinking, boasting thanes. This was no time for stressing whatever divided him from Virgil, Seneca, Plato, and the old Republican heroes." End quote. And so with that in mind, looking to some of the pagan traditions and philosophies that Boethius found particularly palatable will help us to get a better handle on what exactly he is doing in the Constellation. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a high-level look at the emergence of Neoplatonism from the pre-Socratics up to its baptism into early medieval Christian thought with the likes of Augustine. Neoplatonism itself, I should say, was an active force from about the 3rd to 6th centuries or so, and of course it had significant influence beyond that time, even up to the present day. According to Augustine, the Platonists, by which he most directly meant the group of thinkers we today would call the Neoplatonists, provide the pagan school that comes closest to Christian thought, and it is actually most beneficial in helping Christians to systematically formulate what they believe about the nature and working of the cosmos. Not so much that Neoplatonism gives us new substance, but it does give us an intellectual framework for arranging the substance that we have through scripture and through, at this point, early church tradition. And so Augustine and others thought that the Neoplatonists really helped them to formulate their understanding of the nature and the working of the cosmos. And Augustine, of course, was of monumental importance for setting many courses that would continue through the Middle Ages and beyond. And Boethius, who was a couple generations after Augustine, definitely operates within this trajectory. And so I think that we're going to better see some of what's happening in the Constellation if we have a better handle on this system of thought. Now, as a warning, especially if anyone is watching this who is already versed in this topic, this presentation is very much intended to be a summary of some of the major elements at play here in the emergence of Neoplatonism. This is nothing like an exhaustive study of Neoplatonism or any of these connected ideas. For some degree of scale, what I'm about to cover in about 15 slides generally takes about 3 weeks at the beginning of my on-campus medieval philosophy course, and it could easily make for an entire course in itself and beyond. And so with that being said, you can consider this to be a fairly hefty introduction rather than a comprehensive study. And so know that we're not covering any of our sources exhaustively, and we're also not including all the sources that could be brought into this. Alright, with that in mind, let us go ahead and get started with the pre-Socratics. Now, the history of Western philosophy typically begins with a group of philosophers in ancient Greece referred to as the pre-Socratics, because, well, they came before Socrates. Now, on one hand, it's a little bit arbitrary to ever pick a beginning point of philosophy, because the truth is, to be human is to be a philosopher. To be human is to think about the way that the world is and our role within it, and how to move ever closer to the path of wisdom, the path of achieving the goals of human nature. And so that's been happening for as long as we've had consciousness. However, it is helpful to come up with a starting point, and going back to the pre-Socratics, and specifically the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales, kind of makes sense, because these are some of the early sources that we have that we can go to through written records, where we see people intentionally asking questions through reason, like, why is there a basic harmony in nature? What accounts for this? And so they're asking these broad level philosophical questions. They're delving into the fundamental nature of reality. And we have a written pathway to at least approach an understanding of what they were doing. And so this is not a bad place to begin the history of Western philosophy, which is why it usually begins there. And so at this point, with the pre-Socratics, we're mostly relying on fragments of writing and quotes provided by later philosophers. And so because we don't have a lot from these early thinkers directly, they usually just get lumped together into this group of the pre-Socratics. Now, as I just mentioned, the first member of this group, where we usually go for the beginning of history of philosophy courses, is a guy named Thales, who recognized that there is harmony and order in the natural world, and so he wanted to get to the bottom of its cause. Well, he supposed that this harmony is owed to the fact that there must be some element that underlies everything. You break everything down into its most basic level, and you get one thing. And this, he theorized, was water. Now, that might sound a little bit silly to us today, but it makes some sense at his stage of things. For example, plant and animal life requires water. Water is, all around us, especially if you're living in Greece. Water is generally moving, which accounts for change, and water can present itself in 3 states: solid, liquid, gas, and so it's not a bad early contender. Well, Thales was followed by others who proposed other elements, such as earth, air, fire, but early philosophical critiques made it evident that no one physical element could account for everything, because the elements oppose each other. Fire could not be water, air could not be earth, and so forth. And so, Heraclitus takes the conversation in a new direction. Instead of looking to a physical element to describe all of reality, he said that everything is change, or everything is changing, everything is moving, everything is in a process of flux. Now, he did say that the cosmos is made of fire, but this was really just a poetic way of emphasizing the idea that, like fire, the elements are ever moving in and against each other, flaring up and diminishing from moment to moment. But he most famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. As we get quoted from Plato, Heraclitus says somewhere that all things give way and nothing remains. And likening existing things to the flow of a river, he says that you cannot step twice into the same river. And this is because you step into the river, you step into the water, you step out, you step back in, and now you're in new water. And he said this is what all of reality is like. It's ever moving, it's never the same. It's always in a state of process. It's always becoming, it is never being. Now, if this is all that he believed, then it would present some pretty serious problems. For example, if everything is moving, then our knowledge is never accurate, because the picture of the river that we have in our minds, it never corresponds to the way the river actually is in any given moment. It's always out of date, and so our minds are always separated from the state of things around us, because there is no state, there is only process. Also, this would create a crisis of identity, because it would mean that there is no me that endures across time. On a physical level, we know that our cells are constantly being replaced, and maybe I might find recourse to an idea of the soul, but it's not even that continually undergoing change, adopting and pushing away desires, and just continually taking new forms as I undergo experience and as I direct the orientation of my soul. And so even the soul is constantly in a state of change. And so who is the me that I suppose endures across time? Well, if literally everything is moving, then there is no me. There's only a succession of becomings. Well, fortunately, Heraclitus does give us some direction toward constancy, toward stability, somewhere where we might be able to find some rest. So everything, or at least nearly everything, may be changing, but it always changes in a consistent and orderly manner. The river may always be moving, but through reason I can reliably predict how and where it will move, and so change itself is constant. Now, why is this? Well, Heraclitus found his answer in the Logos, or the Word, which is an idea that will become very important in the history of philosophy, and we even see some of this in the New Testament. While some biblical scholars may argue that Greek wisdom is not being referenced here, I've not been completely convinced that it's not at play when John begins his gospel with "Enarche hen ho logos," in the beginning was the Word. And then he proceeds to explain how the world was made through this Word. For Heraclitus, the Word is the one stable reality that holds together what would otherwise be the chaotic and the formless and the void. And I mean, just think about what the word means. Imagine you have a bag of Scrabble tiles and you pour them out, and odds are they're not going to go into the form of a word. You're just going to have a random cacophony of sounds represented by the letters that are formless and void of meaning. Well, the word is the form that it then imposes itself on the letters, arranging them in an orderly way where now they contain and they express meaning. And so a word is what brings order and meaning out of what would otherwise be chaotic and void. That's what a word does, and that is what the Word does on a cosmic scale. As the Apostle Paul says in Colossians, in him all things hold together, because he is the Word, he is the Logos. And for Heraclitus, this Logos does not only explain what we see in the natural world, or better yet, he maintains that we are part of the natural world. Maybe that's a better way of saying that. And so the Logos gives direction for how we live our lives. In following the Logos, the various competing elements of the human psyche and of human desire can find order and move in a unified direction. However, at least based on what we have, Heraclitus is only beginning to develop this Logos doctrine, and so he is principally known as the philosopher of becoming, or of change. On the other side of the spectrum of being and becoming, we have Parmenides, the philosopher of being, who argues that movement is rationally impossible. As he says in his poem On Nature, being is uncreated and imperishable, whole, unique, unwavering, and complete, meaning it has no potential. There's nowhere that it can go. The easiest way to understand his argument is to consider paradoxes that are provided by his student, Zeno. Zeno has us imagine a race between the Greek hero Achilles and a tortoise. Now, obviously, Achilles has the advantage, and so the tortoise gets a head start. To keep the math easy, let's say the tortoise begins 100 yards in front of the starting line, where Achilles begins. The race goes off, and then Achilles takes off. Now, before he can get to where the tortoise began at 100 yards, he first has to cross half that distance. He has to go 50 yards. Well, before he goes 50 yards, he has to go 25. Well, before he goes 25, he has to go 12 and a half, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. And so, rationally speaking, mathematically speaking, it turns out that there is an infinite amount of distance between any 2 points. Well, how long does it take to cross an infinite distance? Well, it takes an infinite amount of time, which is another way of saying that movement is rationally impossible. Now, you may be tempted to say that this is absurd because we experience and observe motion all the time. However, Parmenides believes that there's a conflict between our sense experience and reason, and so we ought to choose reason, right? Because if we're not going to prioritize reason, then what business do we have doing philosophy to begin with? With this move, he really serves as an early modern, as Descartes is going to do the same thing, right? He's going to isolate reason over against sense experience, and that's going to set the tone for a lot of what happens in modern and postmodern philosophy. And I would consider that modern turn, which very much is, I believe, in keeping with Parmenides. I think that it leads to disastrous ends. But in any case, here we have our philosopher of being who believes that reason leads us to a completely stable reality, the world of being. Well, in Plato, being and becoming will both find their place. Parmenides and Heraclitus will be brought together. And I believe that the best introduction to Plato's thought is the one that is usually chosen for this purpose, and that is Plato's allegory of the cave, which is found in the Republic. In this section of the Republic, Socrates has us imagine a cave. In this cave are prisoners who are shackled, and they've been in that position for their entire lives. All they can do is stare at the wall in front of them, and on this wall they see shadows of objects and animals and whatnot pass by. These shadows are the only reality they have ever known, the only thing they've ever perceived. Eventually, one of the prisoners is set free, and how this happens we're not told, but it doesn't really matter for the allegory, and so he's set free. He turns around and he sees the fire that had been producing the cave's light, and he's initially pained greatly by looking at light directly for the first time. And he sees these cutouts that have been passing back and forth in front of the fire to project the shadows. And between the pain of his eyes and the confusion regarding what he's looking at, he's inclined to go back to watching the shadows because they seemed more real to him at this time. However, he is, apparently through no real design of his own, just kind of almost dragged out. He's compelled out of the cave and up to the surface world. And now he's blinded by the light of the sun, but his eyes eventually adjust and he experiences the real things that were previously imaged on the cutouts, which he previously only saw through the images of the shadows. And so now he is in genuine reality, illuminated by the genuine light of the sun. He eventually remembers the prisoners who are still in the cave, and he feels pity on them, and so he goes back to share this new revelation that he's had. Now at this point, he has a difficult time seeing in the darkness because he's used to the light, but he eventually finds his way down, and he tells the prisoners of this glorious reality that he has experienced. Well, they don't take too kindly to this, as they've developed a value system, a hierarchy based on who is best at figuring out the shadow pattern and detecting what would come next. This new revelation shattered their shadow society, and so they initially thought him to be mad, and eventually they got a hold of him and they actually killed him. And of course, when Plato is telling us this story, he very much has in mind his teacher Socrates, who was executed by the city of Athens for practicing his philosophy. In addition to providing a general introduction to philosophy, this allegory gives us some images that are particularly helpful in understanding Plato's system of thought. The shadow world, or the shadowlands, which is a term that C.S. Lewis adopts, is the one that we all have access to by nature, kind of like by default. That's probably an even better word than saying by nature. That's more of a loaded term. And so by default, as material beings in a material world, we all have access to this shadowland. And this is the corruptible world of partial truths, or of obscured truths. Perhaps we can expect to see obscure, particular images of justice, but we will never see the ideal, pure justice in any particular historical instantiation. So too with love and with the ideal of humanity, with loyalty, or even the ideal of a horse or whatever else. All of these ideals, the full actualizations of what things are imperfectly in potential, reside above the material world in what Plato would call the world of the forms. And so by default, we live in the shadowy world of becoming, but we can aspire to the illuminated world of being. After all, if you are to have a shadow, there must be a solid object in order to cast the shadow. Well, the solid objects that cast the shadows are the forms, such as the form of justice and whatnot. These are things that we can know through our minds, but it actually takes more than that. To know justice, for example, is not just to be able to provide a definition, although such propositional knowledge is important. But to really know justice is to be just, to love justice, and to instantiate justice in your life. Remember that philosophy, in its truest sense, is the love of wisdom. Not just the knowledge of wisdom, but the love of wisdom. And so the forms are the highest level of reality that we can consciously know, and as we better know such reality, we gain stability in this world of change. Even when we experience injustice, we ourselves can still be rooted in the unending, eternal reality of justice itself. Well, remember that I said that the world of forms is an illuminated reality. Well, if it is illuminated, then it must be illuminated by something. And this something in the allegory is the sun, which for Plato is the form of the good. Or we would not even be far off to call this God, as Plato seems to do in the Timaeus. Now, admittedly, this is a place of some contention within Platonic scholarship, but for our purposes, I don't believe that this conflation is unfounded. And so God is the light that illuminates the world of the forms, which is the solid substance that casts shadows in the world of becoming. And just as you do not stare at the sun directly to understand its light, but you must instead look to what it illumines, you must look to the effects in order to understand the cause. So too, we only understand God by understanding the forms. You look at the sun directly and you go blind. And this makes sense. If we say that reason is good, then we mean that goodness is a higher reality than reason. Reason participates in the goodness that makes all good things good. And so what this means is that we can never fully apprehend God directly by reason, because the good that makes reason good stands above reason. And so we see this idea in the medievals as well, that as we approach the heights that reason can assail, we have to engage at that point in a kind of mysticism that doesn't work against reason, right? We're still making use of reason. We're not saying anything goes, but there is a kind of mysticism that we need to use to close the gap between reason and God. This gap must be traversed in love and in faith in a realm that goes beyond what reason can assail. And we see this idea in Scripture as well, as we're told that God's presence is engulfed in unassailable light or impenetrable darkness, which are two ways of saying the same thing. This is not a place in which we can see by ordinary means. So for Plato, we have God at the top, then we have forms in the knowable world of being, and then the shadows or particulars are in the world of becoming. And let's flesh this out a little bit more with his dialogue that gives us his creation account, that is the Timaeus. The Timaeus is a fascinating, albeit fairly difficult Platonic dialogue that became very influential in the history of pre-modern thought. As a side note, this is also where we learn about Atlantis, and so that may be a hook for some of you to pick it up. But for now, we're going to talk cosmology, and so let's take a look at this. I'm going to read this fairly long passage, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. In my opinion, we must certainly make this distinction first. What is that which is always and has no becoming, and what is that which is becoming but never is? And so again, we're dealing with being and becoming. Now the former, being ever the same, is comprehended by the activity of nous, along with an account. The latter by opinion, along with sense perception devoid of an account. It comes into being and passes away and never actually is. Again, all that comes into being must come into being from some cause, for it is impossible for anything to be generated without any cause. Now whenever a craftsman looks always to the unchanging, referring to something like this as his model, he will produce its form and character, and all that he fashions in this way will necessarily be beautiful. But if he looks to something that has come to be and uses a generated model, the product will not be beautiful. And so, in this passage, Plato says that we initially have three things. We have the craftsman, who we can shorthand as God, and he's going to refer to as the God. And so we have God, we have the forms, and we have undifferentiated becoming. We could even borrow the language of Genesis 1:2 and call this last piece the formless and the void. In fact, calling it formless is very much in tune with Plato, because you remove form and all you have is the chaotic. You have the formless and the void, something very much like nothingness. Well, the material world as we know it is the formless and void which has become something ordered and substantial, which for Plato is the same thing as saying that it has come to be. It has been made into something real, something knowable. Well, something is not made to be without something that makes it to be. In other words, a crafted work requires a craftsman, who himself must not come to be. He cannot be part of the world of change, and therefore he must be entirely stable. He must be eternal rather than temporal, and he must be the cause of all ordered temporal reality. Now, the design that the craftsman used to order the otherwise formless and chaotic world of becoming is found in the eternal, unmoving world of the forms, which are apprehended by nous, or mind. He goes on to say that it is surely obvious to everyone that the model was everlasting, since the universe is the most beautiful of created things, and the craftsman is the most excellent of causes. So having come into being in this way, it has been made to resemble that which is comprehended by reason and intelligence, and remains the same. And so, in other words, this intellectual blueprint that the craftsman, that God used in order to order the otherwise formless and void cosmos, is itself eternal. It is unmoving. It is in the world. It is in the realm of being. And don't worry, in just a moment, a couple slides, I'm going to give you a visual aid for mapping this out. But first, let's look at one more passage in the Timaeus. And I'm going to go ahead and read this, and then again, we'll talk about it. Well, let us state the reason why becoming and the universe were constructed by the artificer. He was good, and in the good no envy ever arises about anything, and, being devoid of envy, he desired that all things be as much like himself as possible. We would then be absolutely right to accept from men of understanding that this is the supreme source of becoming and of the cosmos. For the god desired that all be good, and as far as possible nothing be imperfect. He therefore took everything that was visible, which was not at rest but moving discordantly and randomly, and he led it from disorder to order, regarding order as entirely superior to disorder. But it was not then, nor is it now, lawful for the supreme good to enact anything except the supremely beautiful. So on reflection, he discovered that, from whatever is visible by nature, nothing that is made without nous is, on the whole, ever better than something which possesses nous, and furthermore, that nous cannot be present in anything in the absence of soul. Based on this reflection, having placed nous in soul, and soul in body, he constructed the universe so that, once completed, it would naturally be as beautiful and excellent a piece of work as was possible. Accordingly, based upon the likely account, we must state that this cosmos is a living creature with soul and nous that has, in truth, come into being through the providence of God. So, we see at the beginning of this passage that God is good, and that he constructed the world to imitate his own goodness to the extent that contingent and moving things can approximate independent and eternal goodness. Now, in order for there to be rational order, there has to be nous, or mind, but minds do not exist by themselves, but are placed within souls. And so, the eternal and unmoving realities are God and the forms. They both operate in this realm of being. But in order for the forms to be instantiated in the moving cosmos, they must be apprehended by nous, by mind. But in order for a nous to be instantiated, it must be placed in a soul. And so, according to Plato, the cosmos itself has a soul, a world soul, that also contains nous, which is directed toward the forms, which are something like the wisdom of God. A little bit later on in the history of thought, this is going to turn into the mind of God. But for now, the exact relationship between the forms and God is not clearly worked out. It's kind of ambiguous in Plato. But as with the cosmos, each individual operates as a kind of microcosm, as we have material bodies that are embedded in the changing material world, which is by nature given order to corruption and formlessness, but we also have souls, which are capable of movement, and we have minds, which rightly oriented by soul can aim upward toward higher, unmoving reality. And ultimately, in doing so, we're moving in the direction of the God that we cannot apprehend by mind. And so we use mind to move toward God, recognizing that God himself exists beyond the reaches of nous, beyond the reaches of mind. And note I'm saying mind singularly, because for Plato, it's not just that we have minds analogous to the divine mind, but our minds are actually kind of sharing in the divine mind. There is nous, not so much nouses. And so in using mind appropriately, we're not just reaching toward God, we are very much relying on God. We're following the divine light that comes directly from God, the divine light that we see when we are reasoning appropriately, that the goodness of God pervades all existent realities. And so in the upward path, you turn inward. You don't turn outward toward material things perceived by the senses, but you turn inward toward the soul. You turn inward toward the mind. And as you turn inward, you are also moving upward. You're going further up and further in. Now here we are with my very sophisticated diagram. Moving in order of priority, moving from substance to nothingness. We have God, who uses the forms, which are something like the wisdom or mind of God, although again, Plato himself is a little bit hazy about this exact connection. But in any case, God uses the eternal forms as blueprints for ordering of the material world, which is by nature formless and void. But the forms need to be apprehended by nous, which needs to be placed within the soul, which mediates between the nous and the body. And on the other side of the ordered body, or matter, we have nothingness, which can also be understood as evil because it is a movement away from the goodness of God. It's movement away from the good order that God imposes on the otherwise chaotic. and we, on the path of wisdom, will use the agency of our souls to prioritize the life of the mind, which reaches toward the forms and ultimately in the direction of God. Alternatively, we also have the option of prioritizing material things and living as beasts, seeking nothing more than the fulfillment of carnal desires, and in so doing, we become deformed, we move in the direction of nothingness, we become as ghosts or shades. It's also worth noting that in this dialogue, Plato indicates that the planets, or wanderers, which is what that word means, are associated with the gods, and they move in ordered, interlocking, spherical motion. In fact, I should say that the Timaeus seems to indicate that these heavenly gods are actually the true gods, as Plato demotes the Greek pantheon to the rank of daemons, a secondary class of divine helpers. And so Plato himself is basically monotheistic. In fact, I would say he is monotheistic. Now, these spherical movements of the planets are derivative of the spherical movement of the entire cosmos, because perfectly consistent spherical movement is as close as moving reality can get to imitating the perfect stability of God. And this understanding of the heavens is the beginning, or at least a significant leap near the beginning, of an important cosmological development that will reach its height in the Middle Ages. And now we are going to jump over to Aristotle. Plato's student Aristotle deviates from his teacher in some rather important ways, but he also maintains some important points of continuity. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle gives us his famous cosmological argument for the existence of a prime mover, or an uncaused cause. This is an important argument in the history of philosophy, and it was readily adopted by the likes of Thomas Aquinas as proof for the existence of God. In this argument, Aristotle makes an argument regarding motion. To summarize, anything that begins to move is moved by something else. Follow the sequence of dominoes back far enough, and eventually you have to arrive at a starting place, or else you have an infinite regress, and without a real beginning, motion would be impossible, so the argument goes. Well, motion is possible, obviously things move, and so there must be a real beginning. There must be something that sets the dominoes in motion. There must be something that moves but is not itself moved. This something is the prime mover, which Aristotle also refers to as God. This God is eternal and fully actualized, meaning it has no potential. There's nothing that it can do because it's already the best it could possibly be. It is eternal and unchanging goodness, eternally contemplating its own goodness, because, well, what else is there for fully actualized goodness to do? If God is fully good, Aristotle proposes, then God will be eternally focused on that which is most good, which is himself. And so this God does not intentionally do anything to set the cosmos in motion. It instead moves the cosmos as a beloved does its lover, by producing desire. This begins with the outermost edge of the cosmos, the sphere of the prima mobile, or the first movable sphere. This outermost level of the cosmos moves in a perfect spherical dance, in imitation of its beloved, the perfectly stable, unmoving God, who is fully actualized goodness. This great cosmic dance then moves through the firmament, or the stellatum, the realm of the fixed stars, then to the planetary spheres of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and finally the Earth, which is stable, almost as a kind of mockery of the stability of God. And we see this idea really play out in Dante, where you go to the center of the Earth, and that's where you find hell. Go to the center of hell, and you find that it is frozen over. And so Satan is perfectly stable, just as God is perfectly stable, but for a very different reason. And so the closer you get to absolute evil, and notice I said the closest you get. And so in this kind of model we're working with, there is no such thing really as absolute evil, because absolute evil would be nothingness. And so even Satan is at least as close to nothingness as you can get. And so as he is on this other side of being, the other side of the spectrum from God, who fully is, Satan also is stable, but for a very different reality. He is frozen over. Satan is stable because he lacks actuality, whereas God is stable because he lacks potential. And so it's a kind of inversion, a kind of mockery of the good. So too, Earth, which is the furthest away from the reality of the prime mover, it is stable for somewhat similar reasons. And so the heavens move in perfect order, but then once you get below the moon, once you get to Earth, we are now at the furthest point away from the initiation of the great dance. We've lost the same sense of desire that we see in the heavens, And so the perfectly ordered movement starts to move into chaos, it starts to move into corruption once we get down to Earth. This is where things are the most chaotic. Well, now let's jump ahead to Plotinus, who is likely the most important foundational figure for the Platonic tradition that would become known as Neoplatonism, which will be essentially Platonic, but with borrowed elements from Aristotle, the Stoics, and others, as well as some innovations aimed to counteract the emerging critiques of Christianity. Of course, the irony is that, at least according to Augustine and those who would sympathize with him, that the Neoplatonists attempted to respond to Christianity, but in so doing, they actually created some useful tools for communicating Christian truth. In any case, let's take a look at a couple quotes from Plotinus concerning good and evil. So for the good, he says that, "The good is that on which all else depends, toward which all existences aspire as to their source and their need, while itself is without need, sufficient to itself, aspiring to no other, the measure and term of all, giving out from itself the intellectual principle, and existence, and soul, and life, and all intellective act." And then of evil, "If the solution is that the one act of knowing covers contraries, and that as evil is the contrary to good, the one act would grasp good and evil together. Then to know evil, there must be first a clear perception and understanding of good, since the nobler existences precede the baser and are ideal forms, while the less good hold no such standing, are near to non-being." Okay, so I know that for many of you, you probably didn't follow that, and that's honestly to be expected at this point. But Plotinus affirms, with Plato, that the good is the ultimate and independent reality on which everything else depends. Because this ultimate good is the one place of absolute order, of absolute unity, Plotinus and the Neoplatonists will often refer to him, to this good, or this God, as the One. This is the place of absolute order, where there is no differentiation, there is no distinction. As with Aristotle's prime mover, this God is eternally focused on its own goodness, and so it's not intentionally related to any external realities beyond itself. However, as it eternally turns in on itself, it also eternally emanates out contingent reality. Think of this like ripples in a pond, or perhaps as a tiered fountain in which water gushes up from the top tier and then trickles down to the other tiers. Or maybe better yet, think of the one as the sun, which casts out its rays not because it chooses to, but because that is its nature, is simply what it does. An object closer to the sun will receive its light and its heat more fully, but this light and its heat will diminish the further away you move. And so emanations closest to the one, closest to God, are good in proportion to said nearness, and more distant emanations are less good, until finally we drop off from existence altogether, just as the rays of the sun eventually dwindle into nothingness. This nothingness, or rather this presence of lack, if we want to put it that way, is what evil is. It is lack. It is a privation of being. It is a movement into formlessness. Now, these quotes here are fairly abstract, and you can spend some time mulling over them if you so desire, but I don't want to get overly bogged down in Plotinus at the moment. If this were a course in ancient or early medieval philosophy, we would spend some more time here, but for our current purposes, it is sufficient to say that the good, or God, or the One, is the only fully actualized reality, and that we are good inasmuch as we approximate this ultimate reality, and that we are evil inasmuch as we turn from this God toward lesser things. Because turning to lesser things, such as through our carnal desires for material goods, orients us in the direction of the formless and the void, which is evil. Now, here we have our cosmological model that looks similar to the diagram that I gave you for Plato. At the top we have the One, or God. The first emanation from God is Plato's nous, although at this point we have some clarification regarding the location of the forms. They exist within the nous, which is now explicitly identified as the mind of God. And so the forms, the ordering principles for creation, this intellectual blueprint, is found within the mind of God. Now, note that this mind is an emanation, yet it is very closely associated with God himself. And so this almost sounds Aryan, which saw the Logos as the best of God's creation, and of similar substance to God, that Greek word being homoousios, but not exactly God, of similar substance, but not exactly the same. Oh, and by the way, in this presentation, I did not include Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish Platonist in the 1st centuries BC and AD, and he belonged to a period of Platonic thought that we now call Middle Platonism, which stands between Platonism proper and Neoplatonism. Well, Philo referred to the mind of God as the Logos, which he also refers to as God's Son. And isn't that interesting? Well, in any case, we have God, and then we have the mind of God, which is the first emanation, and sometimes difficult to fully differentiate from God, but is nonetheless different. The next emanation is soul, in keeping with Plato, and then the material world, and then nothingness on the other side of things. Now, by default, we are born into the material world, the world of shadows, but we are capable of transcending to soul and the mind in the direction of God. Now, in order to go further up in this cosmic hierarchy, you must go within. Again, not because you are anything special in yourself, but because the immaterial aspects of human existence, namely the soul and the mind, participate in the world soul and the divine mind, and ultimately in God himself, or itself. In each soul, we have access to the utmost foundation of reality, because everything that exists is an overflow of God. And so, in each one of us, we can find the divine light of God that illuminates all reality for those who have the eyes to see. And so, when we contemplate inwardly in this fashion, we are not really seeing ourselves at all, but we are seeing the light of God, which draws us further up and further in. If you remember those words from C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, well, you may now have a better image as to what he is talking about, that reality goes further up and further in. And of course, Lewis did not hide his appreciation for the Platonic tradition. The further up we go, the further in we go. And the further in we go, the further up we go. This is how you have worlds nested within worlds. And at its root, we ultimately find the world of God. Now let's take a look at Augustine, who is likely the most important figure in baptizing the Neoplatonic model, as he took what he saw as God's truth held unjustly by the Neoplatonists and brought it back into its proper context, while leaving out what he saw as irredeemable error. Now, Augustine, like Lewis, also did not hide his appreciation for the Platonists. As he says in The City of God, "If, then, Plato defined the wise man as the one who imitates, knows, loves this God, and who is rendered blessed through fellowship with him in his own blessedness, why discuss with the other philosophers? It is evident that none come nearer to us than the Platonists." So, pretty clear claim there. And we see this thought carried out further in this passage of the Confessions, as Augustine says, "What I found in reading the Platonists, not precisely in these words, but saying the same thing in varied and very convincing ways, was this: at the origin was the Word, and the Word was in God's presence, and the Word was God. This was at the origin with God, and all things were made through it, and nothing was made without it. In it life was made, and the life was men's light, and the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness could not control it. Further, that the human soul, however it may bear testimony to the light, is not itself the light. God's word is the true light that gives light to every man who arrives in this world. Further, that he was in this world, and the world was made by him, and the world did not recognize him. But this I did not read there. He came among his own, and his own did not accept him. But to all who accepted him, who believed in his title, he gave the right to become God's sons." And so, as far as a system of philosophy goes, as a structure for understanding what reality is, he believes that the Platonists do a remarkable job of providing a structure that is well suited for articulating Christian truths. However, what he does not find in the Platonists is a real redemption. He does not see the gospel. In the Platonists, he sees a God who supplies the cosmos and man with existence, but not much else regarding redemption, regarding participation in wisdom. There's no personal connection here. The Platonic God never looks on man with grace, never has any initiative toward man. There's no rescue mission. And in fact, a rescue mission such as we have in Christ would be unthinkable, because it would be philosophical sacrilege to suggest that the immaterial, eternal, immutable God would take on a material body. For matter was seen as intrinsically evil, approaching nothingness on the grand hierarchy. And so a Platonist regarding John's gospel would likely be on board with John's teaching on creation, that God made all things through his Logos, until they get to the Logos becoming flesh. And so to be very clear about this, because sometimes some charges are brought against Augustine that he was overly Platonic. Augustine is not a wholehearted Platonist. He believes that the Platonists are of great value, but that even the best that paganism has to offer lacks the gospel. Augustine is first and foremost a Christian, and that is how he approaches the Platonic tradition. And I should also specify that when Augustine refers to the Platonists, he is more likely, or at least more often and more directly, referring to the group that we now call Neoplatonists. He's referring to the Platonic tradition in general. Now, in this same section of the Confessions, Augustine mentions some of what the Platonists did for him. He says that the books of the Platonists did provoke in me a return into myself. You guiding me, I entered my own recesses, though you, helping me, made that possible. Entered there, I could see, so far as I could see anything with my poor soul's vision, something beyond my soul's vision, and beyond my mind, in always unfailing light. Not the light common to all our physical vision, nor simply like that but on a grander scale, as if it had just got brighter and brighter till nothing else could be seen. Nothing of that sort, was it? No, of some other, some far different sort it was. Not a thing layered above my mind as oil floats above water, or heaven above earth, but something higher than I am, because it made me, who am lower because made by it. To know truth is to know this light, and to know this light is to know eternity. It is the light love knows. And so there we have it. Augustine looked within and he saw the light of God. And this is very common Augustinian language, which definitely mirrors the Neoplatonic image of seeing the light of God within your soul. If you read the Confessions, you'll find that Augustine regularly talks about how he foolishly sought God or satisfaction beyond himself in the things that are seen, rather than within. This is the kind of thing that can be very easily misunderstood due to the influence of pantheistic New Ageism and whatnot today. But when Augustine talks about searching within, he is looking for God's divine light, the true light that enlightens all rational souls, as the Apostle John tells us. And he's not looking for himself as God or anything like that. And so this light, which is above him, this light that created him, allows him to see reality within the right context. To know truth is to know this light, and to know this light is to know eternity. It is the light love knows. And this concept and this kind of light imagery leads us right up to Boethius. So sinks the mind in deep despair, and sight grows dim when the storms of life inflate the weight of earthly care. The mind forgets its inward light, and turns in trust to the dark without. Again, when Boethius talks about the inward light, he means the same thing as Augustine, who himself is using a modified version of the Neoplatonic structure of reality. When we set our gaze on material things, we are looking to external things, things that are not by nature part of us, and are nearly nothing. As Boethius says in the Consolation, you can never make what is by nature external to you an internal good. That's not the way that it works. We need to look toward that which we are, and in looking toward that which we are, we find the God who is. Why would you put your hope in the volatile world of becoming that teeters on the edge of the formless and the void, when you have recourse within to access the stable light of divinity that illuminates the rightly ordered and rational soul? This obsession, and I don't mean that negatively, this obsession with light would permeate the so-called Dark Ages, as the great medievals saw all of reality, which is necessarily upheld by God, as bursting forth the light associated with God's presence. And this is such an ennobling, encouraging, and beautiful way of looking at the world. It does not matter how fortune spins her wheel. It does not matter how changing circumstance may appear at any given moment. The changing world will do what it always does. It will change. And so if you set your gaze in this direction, you will become lost in the maelstrom as you approach nothingness. If, however, you cling to the light of God that is present in all of existent reality, as seen through the light of reason that is embedded in your soul, then you will find stability in the God who is, as you strive to think in accordance with the mind of God and to love in accordance with the goodness of God. You move within the great and cosmic dance that moves in response to the goodness of God. And now I will conclude today with the words of the Apostle Paul as he speaks to the Athenian philosophers of Mars Hill. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet, he is not actually far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. With this, we see that even Paul himself engages in such baptism of pagan wisdom. As the Greek poet says, in him we live and move and have our being. Until next time, Godspeed. Alright, thank you for watching on YouTube or listening to the Mythic Mind podcast. As a reminder, both of those options are available to you. If you appreciated this lesson and you'd like to see more of this happen on a more regular basis, as well as on a wider breadth of material, then become a patron over at patreon.com/mythicmind. Every bit of support is helpful. You can sign on for as little as $5 a month, which will give you full Discord access, as well as early and ad-free episodes of all 3 Mythic Mind podcasts, and you get to participate in our live recordings, which we're holding just about every week now. And so if you want to talk books, you want to talk movies, you want to talk video games as they relate to philosophy, personal experience, that sort of thing, then become a patron over at patreon.com/mythicmind. And I would like to thank all of you who are currently patrons, and by name I'd like to thank all 25 of our Tier 3 patrons. So many thanks to Zach E., Zach K., Michael, Kit, Andrew, Aaron, Jack, Adam, Zeta, David, Don, Ross, David, Ross, Justin, Amanda, Chase, Kyle, Tyler, Evie, Justin, Christopher, Jamie, Paul, and William. You all go above and beyond in making Mythic Mind possible, and I really appreciate your support. I appreciate your involvement in this fellowship. The next thing to come out from Mythic Mind will be on Wednesday on the YouTube channel, as well as on the Mythic Mind Movies and Shows podcast, as we talk about Godzilla -1. So I hope you will join us for that, and I will talk to you then.